Go.
All right. Good evening, everyone. We continue on Tzadich Ches Amud Aleph 98a. We are 8 lines from the bottom of the page, and we're in the middle of having conversation. There was a discussion. We're talking, of course, about taruvos, about mixtures, and we were talking about the 60-to-1 ratio, and we had suggested potentially that there might be room for a leniency if I had half a kazayas that I was trying to nullify. Because the thought was that if I have half a kazayas, then I don't have enough to really fulfill any of the prohibition, because it's not a full kazayas, that would be in violation of a prohibition of eating something that is prohibited. But we said, first of all, don't make light of rabbinic shiurim. And second of all, Rabbi Yochanan might have said even a half a kazayas is still a Torah prohibition anyway, even though you might not get punished for it, it's still Torah prohibition. Therefore, don't make light of them. You still need a 60-to-1 ratio, even if you're nullifying a half of an olive. And so on that point, there was a story of a person who came before Rabbi Gamliel bar Rebbe, and Amar Le, he said to him, so what happened was he had a pot of meat that had some kind of prohibited item that was mixed in, and it happened to be, it was 45 times the 45-to-1 ratio. And so he wanted to know, can we nullify that? So he answered, Amar Lei, he said, Abba lo shi'er ba'arba'im v'sheva. He said, my father had a case where there was 47-to-1, and he didn't let that go. So ani eshar ba'arba'im chamesh, how could I let 45-to-1 go? 45-to-1 is even less of a ratio. And then Hahuda also Kami Rabbi Shimon bar Rebbe. There was another story that happened where somebody came by Rabbi Shimon bar Rebbe, and Amar Le Abaloshir ba'arba'im v'chamesh. He said, my father wouldn't let a 45-to-1 ratio go. Va'ani eshaer ba'arba'im v'sholosh. How would I let a 43-to-1 ratio go? Right? That's even less. Hahuda also Kami Rabbi Chia. There was somebody who came before Rabbi Chia. Amar Le Klum Yesh Shloshim. So he said, are there 30? They asked him, I've got some forbidden item that fell into this pot. And he asked him, is there a 30-to-1 ratio? So, Taima Deleka Shloshim. Now, we're deducing from the fact that he asked him that question that the pot was prohibited because there wasn't a 30-to-1 ratio. But, Ha'ika Shloshim Misharin, that means that if there was a 30-to-1 ratio, he would have accepted it. Now, that's astonishing because we were just not accepting 43-to-1 ratios, 45-to-1 ratios, 47-to-1 ratios. How all of a sudden is a 30-to-1 ratio acceptable? So Amri Bichanina, Rechina says, Guzma. He was just, I don't know, was pushing him off kind of a thing. Meaning, is there even a 30-to-1 ratio here? I need 60-to-1. This isn't even a 30-to-1. He wasn't suggesting that 30-to-1 would have been enough. He was just showing him that this mixture is for sure no good because it's not even 30-to-1 when you need 60-to-1. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Shua ben Levi, Mishum bar Kapara. So Rabbi Chia bar Abba said in Rabbi Shua ben Levi in the name of bar Kapara. Kol Yisurin Sheva Torah b'shishim. Anytime that you have a nullification in the Torah, it needs 60-to-1. Now, I believe I was very confused by this Gemara. I'm going to tell you my thought as to what's going on here is we already had suggested that there's a 60-to-1 ratio necessary to remove flavor, right? That's one thing. Now that they're going to go in a different direction and they're going to say that anytime there's a 60-to-1 ratio requirement for prohibited items to permitted items, even when we're not talking about flavors, right? So it doesn't matter. So we're talking about even min bemino, right? It doesn't matter, or b'she'eno mino. It doesn't matter. There's still going to be a 60-to-1 ratio. Amar Lefanov. Now, it could be that this is a rabbinic rule, but it doesn't sound like that from the Gemara, even though I was under the impression that a 60-to-1 was only a rabbinic enactment, but it doesn't sound like that from this Gemara. So let's presume that they're going to be bringing a Torah proof. 60-to-1 is the requirement for nullification, even if flavor is not the issue. Amar Lefanov. So they said before Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak Rabbi. So Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, he said, Rabbi, Ata Omer Kain, you say this in the name of Rabbi Shua ben Levi, in the name of Bar Kapara. Hacham mi Rav Asi am Rabbi Shua ben Levi, Mishum Bar Kapara. This is what Rav Asi said in the name of Rabbi Shua ben Levi, in the name of Bar Kapara. Kol Yisun Shabbat Torah b'meya. You need a 100-to-1 ratio. So they had an argument as to what it was that Rabbi Shua ben Levi had said in the name of Bar Kapara. One said 60 to 1 is the required ratio. One said 100 to 1 is the required ratio. So Ushnehem lo lamdua ella mi zroa b'shela. And the two of them learned it from the same source. And that source was the cooked front leg of the Nazir's korban. Dichsiv. Because here's what's happening. By the Nazir's korban, the Kohen gets to take the front leg. That's his gift. That belongs to the Kohen. Nobody's allowed to eat that other than the Kohen. The rest of the animal, the rest of this of the El Nazir, of the ram of the Nazir, which is taken as a shlomim, is eaten by anybody, right? The owner of the korban gets to eat it. So now, how is it cooked? So the pasuk says, "V'lakacha kohen es zro b'shela." The Kohen takes this leg, the front leg, and Vitanya, we learn in a brisa, b'shela, it has to be cooked, right? That means that you put it into a pot with liquid in there and you're cooking it. Ein b'shela ela shlema. The word b'shela means to cook it means complete and full. Now, Rashi says interesting. Rashi says, well, I don't know what language the word b'shela means complete and full in, right? And so Rashi is assuming this is one of those kinds of drushos like when we had by tefillin betotafos, and we said tot means two and fos means two in different languages in Afriki. Rashi seems to be presuming that that's what kind of a drush this is as well, that there's some language that the word b'shela means complete. Tosfos says, no, it's Hebrew, right? Tosfos says, ein b'shela ela shlema. He says, Kuntra says he doesn't know what language it is. He says it just means bashel la. It is cooked, right? Meaning as it is in its complete state. So therefore, that's what it means. In any event, the word b'shela is teaching me that the leg has to be complete. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says, "Ein b'shela ela shenisbashla im ha'ayil." The word b'shela means that it gets cooked together with the ram. So the rest of the ram and the zeroa get cooked in the same pot. So now let's discuss this machlokes. What's going on here? Dekula alma, everyone agrees that bahadi ayil mivashila, that you're supposed to cook the leg together with the rest of the ram. Mar sover mechatich la v'hodr mivashila. The Tanakama, the first opinion, holds that what you got to do is you have to cut the leg off of the ram, then you put the ram in the pot to cook, and then you put the leg in the pot to cook with it. So you've got two separate pieces, right? You've got the whole ram, and then you've got the leg. Umar Savar, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai holds, Mivashula v'hodr mechatech la. No, he says it's got to be cooked together. When he says it means it's got to be cooked together with the ram, he means it has to be cooked while it's still attached to the ram. So you take the whole ram, you put it in the pot, you cook it, and then after the meat is cooked, you take it out and you cut the leg off and you give the cooked leg to the Kohen, right? Do you cut it off first before you cook it, or you cut it off after you cook it? That's what they're arguing about. V'ibois ema, or else, if you want, you can interpret the machlokas a different way. Dekuliyama mechatich lava hadar mevashula. Everyone agrees you cut the leg off first, and then you cook it together with the ram. Miu, however, Mar Sava, Rabbi Shimon, the first opinion holds, Bahadi Ayil, Rabbi Shimon is the second opinion, right? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon holds, Bahadi Ayil Mivashalo, you have to put the leg back into the pot and cook it together with the rest of the ram. And Umar, the Tanakama holds, Savar B'Kedera Acheres Mivashalo, you cook it in two separate pots. Okay? So now, Lalish Nakama, according to the first version, you have one pot, it's cooking a mixture of a ram that can be eaten by everybody and a leg that can only be eaten by a Kohen. So, Aliba de Divrei Akol. So everybody has to agree that what's happening here, you have to nullify the prohibited leg that's in this pot. So somehow this leg that's in the pot isn't going to make the rest of the lamb invalid, because we're going to see there's a 60 to 1 ratio, or maybe 100 to 1 ratio we're going to see. And Lalish Nabasar, according to the second version, Aliba de Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, according to the second version, you won't have a problem. You don't have to address it according to the Tanakama, who holds that you're cooking this leg in a different pot. But according to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, who says you're still putting the leg back into the pot to cook together with everything else, you will have to address this problem of having an item that can only be eaten by a Kohen mixed together in a pot together with items that can be eaten by everybody. So now, so you basically have to nullify this. So the question is, how are you nullifying it? Man de Amr b'shishim, according to the one opinion, he says it needs 60 to 1. Why? Savar basar ve'atzamos bahadi basar ve'atzamos misharinon. What you have to do is you take the leg together with its bones and meat and everything, and you compare what percentage of the animal is that compared to the full ram with its bones and meat and everything on it. And we have a tradition that's havalei b'shishim, that's a 60 to 1 ratio. So a leg is 1/60th of the total volume of the entire ram. Man de Amr b'meya, the one who says that you need to, and so therefore, based on the fact that you've got this leg that's allowed to be cooked in the pot together with the rest of the korban, we learn that 60 to 1 is the nullification amount. Man de Amr b'meya, the other opinion says it's 100 to 1. Why? Savar basar bahadi basar misharinan. We don't count the sinews and the bones and any of those non-edible parts. That's not what's edible here. The meat is all that's edible. It happens to be that the front leg doesn't have that much meat on it. Therefore, the meat on the front leg is 1/100th of the total meat that's on the ram. So therefore, if you're only counting and measuring by meat, you need 100 to 1 ratio. And so there, we have an understanding that it's a 1/100 ratio. So that's what's going on here. We need to nullify this leg in this pot in order not to make it prohibit the entire rest of the korban. And either it's a 60 to 1 ratio or it's a 100 to 1 ratio, and that's the discussion. Okay, the Gemara wants to know though. We are on. I should have mentioned we were on Tzaddik Ches. We're already halfway down Tzaddik Ches with Beis already. Umiyal finan mina. Can you learn this rule of bittul from this korban? Ve'hatanya, didn't we learn in the Brisa? Zehu heter haba mikal iser. This is a circumstance where the Torah took something which is prohibited in other situations and made it permitted in this one situation. That's what this Brisa says. So zehu lemute mai. So when this says this is the one time that this became permitted, so what are we excluding? Lemute kol isurin shebatorah. We mean that this is the only time that you can use this 60 to 1 ratio or 100 to 1 ratio, and all other times that you have this kind of a ratio, you're not going to be allowed to use it. So therefore, how are you supposed to learn from here that 60 to 1 or 100 to 1 is enough in order to nullify? So Amar Abaye says, no, you're misunderstanding that brisa. Lo nitzricha elo l'Rebbi Yehuda damar min b'mino lo batal. This brisa is going to, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is the famous shita that says that 2 items of the same type are not nullified ever. Right? That's his idea, where we're going to see it in a moment, where he learned it from blood, right? 2 items of the same type. So if I've got meat from a leg and meat from the rest of the ram, they're never going to be nullified. Oh, but wait a second. It is nullified here by this korban. The answer is, this is the exception. But other than Rabbi Yehuda is the one who says this is the exception. Everybody else holds this is not the exception. That's the rule. Okay? So therefore, kamash malan dehacha batil, right? Normally he says it's not nullified. Here it is. Okay, so now, if that's the question, if that's true, why does Rabbi Yehuda hold that min b'mino is not batil? If this is the source that tells me that things are nullified, 60 to 1, it's nullified. 100 to 1, it's nullified. Everybody else says that's fine. Why does Rabbi Yehuda hold ligmar minei? Why doesn't Rabbi Yehuda learn from this korban of the Nazir that 60 to 1 or 100 to 1 is nullified? Why does he say min b'mino is not nullified? So the answer is, Gole Rachmana, the Torah teaches us that 2 items are not nullified in another situation. And that is in Yom Kippur service. The Yom Kippur service says, V'lakach midam apar u'midam ha'sa'ir. You're supposed to take the blood of the cow, of the bull, the blood of the goat. And if you recall from when we were speaking about it a lot, right? You slaughtered the bull, you slaughtered the goat, and you brought the blood inside of the Beis Hamikdash, and you were sprinkling it inside the Kodesh HaKadoshim. You went outside, you were sprinkling it in the Kodesh, you were placing it on the inner altar, and you were doing all of those things. And then at some point, you mix the blood of the bull and the blood of the goat together. What does the Torah call the mixture? The Torah calls the mixture the blood of the bull and the blood of the goat. It's not the blood of the bull, the blood of the goat. The blood of the bull is way more than the blood of the goat. Certainly it nullifies the blood of the goat. Says the Torah, no, it does not. Tarvaihu behadi hadadu nidu. Both bloods are still in existence. You can't nullify blood in other blood because there's min b'mino. They are the same type, and therefore you can't nullify it v'lo batli. Therefore, Rabbi Yehuda holds that two items of the same type are never nullified. Oh, but wait a second. We see that it is to this meat of the Nazir is nullified in the pot. The answer is that's an exception. That's not the norm. That's how Rabbi Yehuda learns it. Well, my chazis de gemaris mehech ligmar mehai. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda, you've got one place where it says the two things don't mix, and you've got the two things don't nullify, and then you've got another circumstance where you say that it does nullify. Why don't you learn that it is nullified always, and it's an exception to the rule when it comes to the blood? So the answer is Chiddush hu mechiddush lo gamrinon. He says, well, the zroa b'shela, this cooked item, this cooked leg in the pot, that is unusual. You can't learn from unusual cases. What's so unusual about it? Because even if it was to be nullified, we have a rule. You're not allowed to intentionally nullify something. You're not allowed to take something that is prohibited. Let's say I have a large pot of meat. Can I put a drop of milk in it? No, I cannot. Say, well, it's going to be nullified. You can't intentionally nullify it. So therefore, this is an unusual thing because that is the Torah telling us in the first place, what you're supposed to do is take this leg and cook it together with the rest of the ram. That's unusual. So if Rabbi Yehuda says, since that's unusual, that's the unusual case. The main case is the blood, which tells me that two items of the same type cannot be mixed together. So ihachi, if that's true, lemea v'shishim nami lo ligmar. So, okay. So then fine. Rabbi Yehuda holds that min b'mino is not nullified ever. But when you have min b'she'eno mino, that is nullified, right? If you have two items of different types, those are nullified, and they're nullified in 60 to 1. They're nullified in 100 to 1. Where does Rabbi Yehuda learn that from? He shouldn't learn it from the Zroa B'Shela. He shouldn't learn it from Nazir, because that's an unusual case you just said. So the answer is, Atu anon lekule gamrinon, lechumra gamrinon. 1 second. We're not trying to go leniently. We're trying to go strict. The Torah, if I wasn't going to learn that I need a 60 to 1 ratio to nullify in the case by learning it from the case of the Nazir's Korban, what would the nullification be? Well, the Torah tells us, generally speaking, demidoraisa beruba batel. Generally speaking, the Torah requires a simple majority to nullify something. If I have a 2 to 1, I have two kosher items, one non-kosher item, that would be enough to nullify. However, this pasuk is telling me I need a 60 to 1. Now, you're going to tell me don't learn from the case of the Nazir's offering because it's unusual. Well, I will tell you, I can learn it because I'm actually going much stricter. I'm not trying to find a leniency. And I will say that if in the circumstance where you're looking at a korban and you're going to be using some kind of a leniency by this korban, in that you're allowed to nullify it in the first place, right? You're allowed to nullify it at the outset, then for sure, when you're not allowed, you definitely have to be strict, and you definitely have to require a 60 to 1 ratio. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says. The only circumstance where I don't use a 60 to 1 ratio, says Rabbi Yehuda, is when it's min b'mino, where I can't nullify it at all. But once I can nullify it, then we should learn the strictness from here and require 60 to 1. Okay, so that's where we are. It's either 60 to 1 or 100 to 1, min b'she'eno mino. But if you don't learn like Rabbi Yehuda, it applies even to min b'mino as well. Okay. Another answer, Rava Omar. Rava is going to give another answer. We had this brisa that we had said that the case of the Nazir was unusual was very unusual. This is the circumstance that this occurs, and not by other cases. And we had answered, what was that brisa talking about? That was talking about the 60 to 1 the nullification, the ability to nullify is in this circumstance, not in other circumstances. That was Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Okay, now we have a different answer. Rava Amar lo nitzricha ella litam ke'ikr. He says we've got another thing, which is normally, right, we have this rule of tam ke'ikr. Tam ke'ikr means that the taste of something, the flavor that comes out from it, is like the prohibited item itself, right? And normally we say de bekadshim aser. Normally we would say that when it comes to kadshim, it's prohibited. And we will see, I think it's coming up, that we will just remind ourselves of this, of the halacha there. But bottom line is, we're going to discuss it in a moment, but may as well mention it just now, just understand what this line means. We had learned that if, let's say, I have a hot piece of a korban chatos and a hot piece of a shlomim, and I'm a kohen, right? So I touch the two of them together on my plate because it doesn't matter to me. I can eat them both. Now, as a result, the shlomim has absorbed the flavor from the chatos. The shlomim now takes on all of the rules of the chatos. Now, what changes? Only a kohen can eat a korban chatos, and so I can't share it with my non-kohen friend. Not only that, but a chatos has to be eaten in the Beis Hamikdash, in the Azara, right? But a shlomim can be eaten anywhere in Yerushalayim. The flavor transfer from the chatos makes the shlomim like the chatos itself. That's the rule. Tam ke'ikr. The flavor that transfers is like the main thing. And so therefore, generally speaking, the flavor that comes out from this leg should go into the ram and make the whole thing prohibited, right? So therefore, because the flavor of the zroa, the flavor of this leg is transferring over to the ram should be prohibited. And nevertheless, kamash malon hacha dehashari. Here we're saying that it is permissible, right? Even though, right, but we don't learn that rule to other kodshim. We say that is not the case. It has nothing to do with bittul. Bittul we learn, right? The one thing that we don't want you to think is we don't want you to think that despite the fact that this is cooking in the same pot, that the zroa touches the ram and that potentially the flavor is imparted. So now we would see from there that the flavor from the zroa doesn't impact the rest of the korban. Don't learn that to any place else, because any place else, if you take a piece of a flavor from one korban, it transmits to the other one, right? So don't think that. Veligmar mina. So why don't we learn that is the case? Why don't we now say that this is a rule that we should learn, and we should say that the flavor transfers, that the flavor is not important, transfer from one to the other. So the answer is I can't, because Goli Rahmana, the Torah specifically tells me, we're in Tzadi Testament Aleph, the Torah specifically tells me Gabe Chatos by a Korban Chatos, which we just mentioned. Kol asher yiga bivsara yikdash. Anything that touches the meat of the Korban Chatos becomes holy like the Korban Chatos, Lios Kemoha. It will have the same halacha as the Korban Chatos. She'im Pesula, if this Korban Chatos was pasul, tipasel. So whatever it touches now becomes a pasul korban chatos. V'im keshera, and if it is a kosher korban chatos, kechamor sheba. Now you have to keep the stringencies of the korban chatos on that meat that it touched. As we said, it has to be eaten inside the Beis Hamikdash. It has to be eaten by a kohen, by a male kohen. So those are the rules, right? Those are the rules of transfer of taste. So therefore, the brisa is saying, you should not learn from the zroa b'sheila, from the cooked leg of the Nazir's korban, that it is not important to worry about the transfer of flavor. The reality is that we do have to worry about it. Now, why did you decide to learn that by kodshim we were going to learn from the chatos rather than learning it from the ram's offering? So the answer is chidashu mechidash lo gamrinon. The answer is because we had said that the ram of the Nazir is unusual in that we are nullifying it in the first place, right? So therefore, since that's unusual, that's the one we're not going to learn from. Ihachi, so lemea v'shishim nami lo ligmar. If you're going to tell me it's so unusual, then why are we learning the 100 or the 60 from it as well, from there anyway? And so we answer the same thing. Atu anon lekula gamrinon lechumra lo gamrinon demi de oraisa beruba batil. The answer is we're not learning it to make a leniency. We're learning it to make a stringency, because from the Torah's perspective, a majority would be sufficient. And now we're saying that you required 60 or 100. Okay, that's the second answer. Ravina gives a third answer to what it is that we're not learning from the Nazir. Lo nitzricha ella lemakom chatach. We have a rule of the place that something gets cut. De Omar, because normally we say, and we said this above on Daf Samech Ches Amud Beis when we were talking about the fetus that stuck its leg out of the mother, and then we cut it off. So we said that the portion of the piece that wasn't cut off also can't be eaten because it was in contact with the part that got cut off. So demokom chatach bi'alma asur. Generally speaking, when you cut off the prohibited part, another little piece after that is also prohibited. But v'hacha shari, but here that's not the case. Here, right, you're gonna, once you cut, the part that you cut is the Kohen section, and the other part is the regular section, and you don't have to then cut off a little sliver of extra meat from the main part of the ram, even though that's the case when it comes to other halachos, in other circumstances. And Yosef Rav Dimi, the Kamar Lala Hashmeisa, Rav Dimi was sitting, and he was telling over this halacha. Amar le Abaye says to him, Kol Yisurin Shabbatorah b'meya. He says, is it true, right, that all of the prohibitions in the Torah, the nullification is 100? V'hatnan, we learned in a Mishnah in Meseches Urla. Lema amru kol hamechametz umitabel umidameya lahachmir. What was the topic that was being discussed? The Chachamim made a statement that anything that you have a dough, you have they would make their bread like like sourdough, right? So they would have a starter, right? A starter. They use like a live yeast culture, not like we do with like the powdered yeast. So they're basically like sourdough. So they took this amount of mechametz. The mechametz was the starter, right? That would cause the bread to become leavened, right? And it mixes together with the rest of the dough. Also, we could have a situation of mitabel. Mitabel is when I take spices that are truma, right? So somebody grows pepper, right? And peppercorns, and he's going to take a portion, he's going to give it to the Kohen. Now the Kohen's got these peppercorns. This guy wants to takes some of this pepper and he spices his soup with it. Okay, so there's going to be another different type of a shear for that. Also, midameya. Midameya is when somebody cooks chulin and truma together, right? He's got two items. He's got chulin items and truma items, and he mixes them together. So, when is it that the Chachamim said lahachmir, to go stringently? And the answer is min bemino. When the two items that you're mixing together are of the same type, we are going to be strict. Lahakel ulahachmir. When is it that sometimes we go strict and sometimes we go leniently? That's min b'she'eno mino. That's when you have two items that are not the same type. Okay, so now we got to explain. There's a confusing statement. V'ktani seifa. Then the end of that brisa explains. Lahakel ulahachmir. What is the circumstance of sometimes we're lenient, sometimes we're strict? Min v'she'eno mino. That's the circumstance where they are of different types. Ketzad. What is the situation? So when is it? What meaning? What are we going to do? When are we going to go lenient and when are we going to go strict? If I've got griesin are beans, right? Ground up beans, okay. And shnisbashlu im ha'adoshim, and I cook it together with some lentils. The lentils, the griesin, the ground up beans, those are truma, and the ground up lentils are chulin. In yesh bahem benosein tam, if they're going to give a flavor, now they're two different types, right? So we're two different things. One's beans, one's lentils. So if you have enough that they're going to give a flavor, the beans are going to give a flavor to the lentils. Ben yesh bahem lahalos b'meya ve'echad. So it doesn't matter if you've got 101 lentils compared to the beans. Once it gives a flavor, meaning what? It's 100 plus 1, right? So if you've got 101 times if you've got 101 times the lentils, then you have beans. It doesn't matter. The flavor's still there. So therefore, bein ein behem lalos mechad, or you don't have enough, it's still also it's going to be prohibited. That's where we're going to go strict. Why? Because there's flavor. So you're going to go by the flavor. Ein behem benosein tam. However, if the flavor has already been nullified, so then, bein sheyesh behem la'alos b'mea ve'echad, bein ein behem la'alos b'mea ve'echad, mutter. So then, it doesn't matter if you've got 101 ratio or not. Either way, it's nullified because we're going to worry about taste. We're not going to worry about the rest, the volume. It doesn't have, that's their point. If it's min b'she'eno mino, sometimes it's stringent, sometimes it's lenient. Because if it's stringent, if you have flavor in it, you could wind up needing much more than the amount to nullify it. If it doesn't have any flavor, you'll need much less to nullify it, right? So now, ein bahen. Now the Mishnah said, right? How much? What was the volume that we said? Ein bahen la'alos b'mea ve'echad. Right? So even if it doesn't have 101 to 1 ratio, ela b'mai, so rather what would the ratio be that you would need? Lav b'shishim, doesn't it mean that you need a 60 to 1 ratio? Because the Mishnah says you don't need 100 to 1, you don't need 101 ratio. You need a different ratio, right? That's what it sounds like. What's the next less ratio? 60 to 1. That's what he's saying. You need 60 to 1 ratio now in order to nullify the flavor. So therefore, he says, what are you talking about that 100 to 1 is a nullification when it comes to min b'she'eno mino items that are of different types? Here it clearly says 60 to 1 is sufficient. So he answers, so Rav Dimi answers back to Abaye, lo, b'meya. No, you're missing it. You don't need 101 to 1 ratio. You need 100 to 1 ratio. That's it. One difference, right? If, right, you need 100, you don't need 101 to 1, you just need 100 to 1. Okay, now, says Abaye, back to Rav Dimi, v'hami dereisha b'meya havi, but in the first case, right, the first part of the Mishnah, which is talking about min b'mina, 2 items of the same type, and therefore that says, there, it says we're going to go l'chumra, and we're going to go strict, meaning you always need a 100 to 1 ratio. So that means seifa b'shishim. That means when the seifa, the second part of the Mishnah, says sometimes it's lenient, we need a lesser amount. It should be a 60 to 1, not 100 to 1. So the answer is tikatani ratio. Because here's what the beginning part said. The beginning part says, lahachmir, when we're going to go min b'mina, we said that when it comes to 2 items of the same type, we're going to be strict. Okay? So, ketzad, what's the cases? What are the cases? Se'or shalchitin. I've got sourdough. I've got the starter. And I mix it together with dough, wheat dough. Shenafal li'isas chitin, right? I've got wheat starter that falls into the dough that's made from wheat. V'yesh bo kedei lahachmitz. And I've got enough of the starter that once I mix it into the dough's going to rise. Bein yesh bo kedei lahalos b'mea ve'echad. Bein ein bo kedei lahalos b'mea ve'echad. Aser. It doesn't matter whether I have 100 to 1 ratio or I don't have 100 to 1 ratio, since there's enough starter to make this dough rise, it's prohibited. Now, this is even min b'mino, even of the same type, right? So it's still going to be prohibited. However, ein bo lahalos b'mea ve'echad, if there isn't a 100 to 1 ratio, here's the other strictness, bein sheyesh bo kedei lahachmitz, bein she'ein bo kedei lahachmitz, aser. If it doesn't have 100 to 1, even if it doesn't have enough in it to make the dough rise, it's still aser. meaning you're going to need both things. You need at least 100 to 1, and even if it has 100 to 1, if it still makes the dough rise, it's still going to be usr. So therefore, it's a very strict situation when it comes to min bimino, two items of the same type. Two items of a different type, we said, oh, I don't have to worry about 101 to 1. I'm going to follow flavor. That's what we said about that. So now, Abaye is saying, if the beginning part of the Mishnah says that you need 100 to 1 when it comes to min bimino, then the second part of the Mishnah, which says you don't need that because we're going to go leniently, must be talking about a lesser volume. Therefore, it should be 60 to 1. So the answer Rav Dimi gives is Reisha v'Seifa b'meya. I'm sorry, this is a question. This is Abaye's answer. Abaye says Reisha v'Seifa b'meya. How could both the beginning case, where you're talking about the stringent case, require 100 to 1, and then the lenient case also be 100 to 1? That doesn't make sense. So, lo, not true. So Rav Dimi says to Abaye, Reisha, you're missing it. The first one is b'meya v'chad. It's 100 to 1 ratio. But Seifa, the second case is b'meya. I need the second one. The leniency is, sorry, so the first part is the stringent one is where I have a 101 to 1 ratio. The leniency is I only need a 100 to 1 ratio. It's 100 to 1 ratio, which is less, which is a little bit striking. That one difference, 101 to 1, is much more significant than 100 to 1. And Rishonim discussed that issue. But let's say that yes. Amai lo batel. He says, but one second. If it's got, right, enough in order to make the dough start to rise, 101, right? So then why isn't it nullified? Right? If 101 to 1, right? So is there such a thing? That's what Abaye wants to know. Is there such a thing that is so strong that even at 101 to 1, it's still not nullified? 100 to 1, okay. Sometimes you can have to say, I can tell me it's still not nullified. But if you're telling me that the beginning of the Bryce is telling me that even at 101 to 1, it's not nullified because the flavor is so strong, where do you see that? So Ishtik, Rav Dimi did not have an answer to that question. He wasn't sure he could think of a circumstance where there was such a thing as 101 to 1 and a flavor being so strong that it wouldn't be nullified. But then Abaye reminded him. Amar le, Abaye said to Rav Dimi, Dilma shani seor dechimutzo kasha. Could be that the dough, the starter, is way stronger than a flavor because it actually makes the dough rise. It changes the composition of the dough in such a significant way that it isn't nullified even at 101 to 1. Amar le, to which Rav Dimi said to Abaye, Ad karton milsa, you've just reminded me of something. To Amar Rav Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina, Rav Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina says, Lo kol hashiurin shavin. Not all of the sizes to nullify are all the same, right? Different sizes. For example, sharet seer. Take a look at fish brine. Fish brine is very pungent. Shiuro korov l'masayim. You need to have a 200. You might need a 200 to 1 ratio because the flavor is so strong. Ditnan, as we learned in a Mishnah, dag tome tsiro usser. If I have non-kosher fish, the brine that the non-kosher fish is in is prohibited. It absorbs the flavor of non-kosher fish. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, revius bisasayim. A revius of brine in 200 revius is, in a sasayim, in 2 sa'ah of kosher fish brine, right? Which is in 2 sa'ah, it's almost 200 reviuses fitting into that. So he says that basically the size, you see that fish brine has a much different shear. So therefore, he says, you reminded me of, so therefore, Abaye, don't be so astonished that there's such a thing as a 100 to 1 ratio when it comes to dough starters, because it could be it has a different volume than others in terms of nullification. V'hamar Rav Yehuda min b'mino lo batel. But the Gemara wants to know, 1 second. Rabbi Yehuda just said something very fast, right? We're just trying to quote. What was it that Rav Dimi just quoted? Rav Dimi just said, Rav Yehuda suggests that if I've got non-kosher fish brine mixing in with kosher fish brine, a 200-to-1 ratio, maybe close to 200-to-1 ratio. Well, who said that? That was Rabbi Yehuda. Wasn't Rabbi Yehuda the one who says nothing is ever nullified in the same type? How could fish brine be nullified in fish brine when Rabbi Yehuda says 2 items of the same type are never nullified? So the answer is, Shani tzir dezeya be'omahu. Fish brine is different than the prohibited item itself. Rabbi Yehuda always says that 2 items that are of the same type can't be nullified. But the flavor of 2 items can be. And what happens is the fish brine itself, the brine is not the prohibited item. The non-kosher fish is. So therefore, the fish brine is absorbing the flavor from the non-kosher fish. That's mixing together with fish brine from the kosher fish. And therefore, we're talking about 2 items with absorbed flavors, not the items themselves. That's why. Next, the next thing the Mishnah said is Ketzad Misharinon. How are we supposed to know if we've got 2 items that are of, we had the git anosh that was mixed in a pot of other gittin. How do I know whether it's going to, if they're the same type, how do I know whether it would give flavor? We said we're going to measure the amount that would need for meat to give flavor in a turnip. Amar Rav Huna says, Kebasar beroshe lifatos. We're using meat in the tips, the tops of the turnips, I guess maybe they're more absorbent. Mm-hmm. So Masnisen, our Mishnah, right, is Delo Kahaitana. Our Mishnah doesn't hold like the opinion that we had said earlier. Tanya, we learned in a brisa, Rabbi Yishmael Benosha Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Omer Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka said, Ein begitin benosein tam. That the Gidon Nosha doesn't impart any flavor. What's the whole problem that our Mishnah is talking about? Our Mishnah says, I cooked the Gidon Nosha in the thigh of the animal. The thigh is kosher meat, the Gidon Nosha is non-kosher meat. And then we said, well, we have to measure the amount in order to make sure it's 60-to-1 to make sure it doesn't impart flavor. Well, that means you have to presume that a Gidon Nosha can impart flavor in the first place. Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, says it never imparts flavor. If it doesn't impart flavor, you don't have to worry about a 60-to-1 ratio to nullify it because it's not imparting any flavor. So therefore, our Mishnah isn't going according to that opinion. There was once a person who came before Rabbi Chanina, and he said, Hava Yosef Rabbi Yehuda bar Zvina Abava. And at that time, when this fellow came in, right, he had he was coming to ask a shayla. And he had a pot, which had a gidon nosha mixed in together with the rest of the prohibited item. And he was coming to ask Rabbi Chanina the question, right? But Rabbi Yehuda bar Zavina was sitting outside, right? Sitting outside the Rebbe's house. He was learning. And he watches this guy go in to the Rebbe's house with his pot of meat, which has a gidon nosha in it. So Nafak, when the guy came out, Amar Lei, my Amarlach, he said, what did the Rebbe tell you? So Amar Lei, Shar Yanileh, he said it was permitted. He said it was fine. So Amar Lei, so he said, Hadar Aili Lekame, go back. He must have made a mistake. Go back in and ask the Shaila again. Amar, so Rabbi Chanina, the guy goes back in. And Rabbi Chanina says to him, Man hai de Kumatzarli. Why are you here? So he says, the guy outside told me to come back in. So he says, who's the guy outside who's bothering me with this question? So Zil Omar Le Lamandi Yosef Abava. Go tell the guy who's sitting out there by the gate, right, the peanut gallery, Ein Begidin Benosein Tam, that I don't care that it's not batal, it's not 60-to-1, because the Gidon Nosha doesn't give any flavor. And therefore, this pot is kosher. Ki asu lekami de Rabbi Ami. So when they came before Rabbi Ami in order to ask him this issue about the Gidon Nosha that mixes together with cooked foods, Mishader Luhu Likame Rabbi Yitzchak ben Chaluf. He sent the people who were asking the question over to Rabbi Yitzchak ben Chaluf, Demori ba lehetera, because he was being lenient. Mishum Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, because he was following the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Vele lo svirle. He himself, Rabbi Ami, didn't hold that way. So therefore, he didn't want to say for himself. He says, "I'm machmir, I don't eat it, but I don't want to tell other people not to eat it." Therefore, he would tell everybody, "You want to ask that question? Go to so and so and ask him the question," because he knew that they would get the answer that was mutter. Okay. The hilchasa, the halacha is ain begidin benosein tam, that the gid anasha does not give any flavor. So if your gid anasha falls into your cooked item, it does not transfer flavor and doesn't create any problems. Next thing the Mishnah said, gid anasha sheniz bashel. I've got a gid anasha, falls into my stew, and I've got a whole bunch of other tendons and sinews in the stew as well. And now, you don't recognize, right? Now you're gonna, if you recognize which one it is, so then you're gonna pull the gid anasha out because it remains prohibited, and then you're gonna assess the flavor. Remember, our Mishnah is the one who says that the gid anasha does give flavor. So you're gonna assess, is there a 60-1? So now, ve'libtul beruba, the question the Gemara wants to know is, why do you have to pull the gid anasha out? You just said once it's 60-1, it's nullified. So it's nullified. So just eat the gid anasha now. It's fine, right? Kuf amid aleph. So the answer is bir yoshani. You can't nullify the gid anasha because it is a complete entity. And as a complete entity, it can never be nullified. So therefore, you always have to pull it out. Okay, next the Mishnah says, "V'chein chaticha shel nevela." So too, if I've got a piece of a nevela, or I've got a piece of a non-kosher fish, falls into the pot together with all the other kosher items. So you have to take out the prohibited one and then measure the flavor. So the question that we ask there is v'ti balta beruba. Why don't we say that it becomes balta barov, the majority of it in there, right? Why do I have to pull out the one that's prohibited? It should be batal. So the answer is, well, we have a machlokas that we've discussed before. It starts in Maseches Beitza. We've mentioned it before. We have the, can't remember what we did. Was it Zvachim, right? Zvachim. That is right. So in Zvachim, we mentioned that we have two ways of looking at selling items. You can sell something by bulk, or you can sell it individually, right? Some items are always sold in bulk. Some items are sold individually. Some items are sometimes sold one way or the other way. For example, right? I could say that I always sell in bulk peanuts, right? Nobody sells 7 peanuts. People buy a pound of peanuts, right? I then know that something that is sold individually, a suit, right? I go to the store. I don't buy 7 pounds of suits. I buy a suit, right? I buy 2 suits, right? Something that sometimes can be sold individually and sometimes can be sold in bulk, eggs, right? Sometimes I buy a dozen eggs. I can buy a pound of eggs. I can buy, right? Sometimes one way, sometimes the other way, maybe. Just making those up, right? So now, the question is, if you've got something which is sold individually, so it is also unique and special, it cannot be nullified. Something that is sold in bulk can be nullified. So now, the question is, what about those items that are kol shadar golimnos? Anything that is sometimes sold individually. So those items that are sometimes sold individually. So if you say that it means some things that are sometimes sold individually, they're also not nullified. So then that's fine. So then great. So then that's going to be fine because there's going to be no bittul. Right? These items, these pieces of meat that are going to be in there, sometimes you sell them by the steak, sometimes you sell them by the pound, and so therefore they're not nullified. But according to the opinion that says that no, the only things that are not nullified are the things that are only sold individually, how are you going to explain why our Mishnah says that these pieces are not nullified? So the answer is, Shani chaticha ho uru'uya lizkabed bolifnei ha'orthim. There's another reason why these items are not nullified, and that is because as a nice piece of meat, they are considered to be significant because you would serve them to guests. And since they are nice enough to serve to a guest, then they are not nullified. Okay, utricha. Now the Mishnah has to tell me all of these different circumstances when bittul is not going to apply. Why? Because the Ishma'inon Gid, if you had told me about the Gid HaNosheh, I would have said Mishum Debir Yohi. I might have thought that it's because it's a complete item. And Ava Chaticha, but when it comes to a piece of meat, Emalo, I would say no. Iashma'inon Chaticha, and if you told me the piece of meat is not nullified, I would say Hova Ru'uya Liskabed. I would have thought because that's chashuv, because it's being able to be served to guests. Liskabed Bali Orchim, because I'll serve it to guests. Aval Gid. But the Gid HaNosheh, which nobody would serve to a guest, Emalo, I would say is not nullified. So the Mishnah says both cases, right? I'm going to nullify both cases. Dorosh Rabba Bar Chana. Rabbi Chana taught as follows: Chaticha shel nevela v'shel dag tameh. If I've got a piece of meat, or fish that's not kosher, Eina oseres ad shetitain tam berotev ubakifa ubachatichos. It doesn't make the whole mixture of the stew no good until it provides flavor to everything in the stew, right? And that means that we're talking about the gravy, we're talking about the fine pieces that settle on the bottom of the pot, or the chatichos, the other pieces of meat. You need to have 60 to, it has to be less than a 60-to-1 ratio. Oki Rav Amora Olei. So Rav, right, placed his Amora. He established his Amora. Remember, we had talked about these Amoras. These are the guys that had loud voices and they would declare halachos. Vidorash, and he taught as follows. Kevan shenosan tam bechaticha. He says, once the prohibited item gives flavor first to another piece, then chaticha atzma nasnis nevela. We have this rule of Chanan. The chaticha, the piece of meat itself, transmits flavor to the next piece. That next piece becomes as prohibited as the original piece. So, for example, if I had a piece of non-kosher meat and it touches a piece of kosher meat, and then the two of those pieces fall into the pot, I have 60-to-1 to nullify my original non-kosher piece of meat. That's not going to be enough because the other piece of meat has become not kosher as a result of touching the first piece of meat. It is considered as non-kosher as the original piece of meat, right? And it's oseres kol chatichos kula, and it's going to now make all of the other pieces prohibited. Mibnei shehein mina, because they are all of the same type. They're all of the same type. They're all meat. So they're all going to transfer the taste, and it's all going to become prohibited. Amar Rav Safra l'Abaye. Rav Safra says to Abaye, Michti, 1 second. Let's take a look at what just happened here. Rav keman amr l'shmate. Who is Rav holding like here? He's holding Rabbi Yehuda. He's saying like Rabbi Yehuda's opinion because he ended off Damar min b'mino lo batal. He said that you can never nullify any of the pieces of meat in the pot. They're all the same type of meat. So my iria kinos and tam. So why does he say that it matters if it gave off flavor, right? Afilo kilonos and tam nami. Even if it doesn't give off any flavor, it's min b'mino, and therefore it doesn't have to give off any flavor. It's going to prohibit it. So Amar Le, so he said back to him, what are we dealing with here? Beshekodam visalko. What you did is you took the original piece out. You took the original piece out. And therefore, right, you're right. You've got min b'mino. If I've got this piece of meat mixed together with all the other pieces of meat, you're right, it's not going to be nullified, and all the other pieces of meat are now nullified. But if I took the original piece of meat out, so then what am I dealing with? I'm dealing with the flavor from the meat in the in the stew with everything else. So therefore, that's what I'm dealing with, is just the flavor. Rava Amar, Rava says, I'll give you a different answer. Afilu tema lo kodem v'salkum. Even if you don't take the meat out. He says, have min b'mino v'davar acher, right? He says what we've got is, we've got meat in a stew, and we've got vegetables, and we've got gravy, and we've got everything, all kinds of other things there. So now what happens is, kol min b'mino v'davar acher. If I've got meat, treif meat with kosher meat, and all the other items in the pot, solak es mino kemishain eno. So the one that's of the same type, right, doesn't count anymore because it's mixed together with all of these other non-mino type things. V'she'ein mino rabba alav umevat lo. So therefore, you just take a look and you say, look, I've got so much 60-to-1 of these carrots and stew and everything that's there. So therefore, you just say look, that piece of meat that's kosher doesn't help to nullify because you can't nullify min b'mino. But everything else in that pot can nullify the non-kosher meat. So therefore, that can nullify the non-kosher meat. Therefore, that's why he says you got to worry about the flavor, because if the flavor still matters and transfers over to the other items that are not min b'mino, then that piece of meat does become prohibited. Okay, this is a good place for us to stop at the Mishnah.
Perfect. Go ahead,
Go
Rabbi
ahead.
Loiterman. Beautiful.
We'll be in touch.